I'm Hartwig Fischer, Director of the British Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Era of Reclamation talk. I invited Bonnie Greer to curate a project, and together we identify reclamation as a prevalent theme of our era. This is also an opportunity to listen and to learn as we move towards the great transformation of the British Museum.
Welcome all of you to this talk with Olivette and to talk about her new book. It's called African Europeans: An Untold History. Now, I found my name in it. Now, you know, I'm only saying that because the title of the book is African Europeans, and I was born on the south side of Chicago. I mean, I've lived here half my life, but I thought I'm not a European. And then I realized as I went through the book that this is a provocation that you've made. It's not just a title. It's a provocation, it's a challenge, it's a dare.
The title, yeah, it is a provocation because it's really about several strands that I have been examining over the last, 20 years or so. And it was really hard for me to bring them together. And then I decided that, why not go for it? And then if it doesn't make sense to people, well, tough, because it does make sense to me. It's about identity. And it's about, trying to shift our perception of what identity is. And yes, you're in the book because, I'm not European. Well, actually, yes, you are. You don't want to admit it, but it's a sense of home. It's the idea of home. Home is where many things are. Home is not necessarily where we say it is. It's where our heart is. It's where our experiences, some of our experiences made us, transformed us, are. So I see you as an African European, sorry.
What you demonstrate in the book and what you prove and you show is that there's a moment, and first of all, I just want to give a shout out to the first Medici Duke, which was always a controversy about whether he was a man of African descent, the Medici, and of course now you lay out the story of the founder of this great dynasty of the rulers, practically of Italy, during the Middle Ages, and huge patrons of art, huge story of Europe in the medieval time, Medici. And this began with a man whose mother was of African descent in Italy. So we have this land, we have this Europe as a place where Africans are there. And I would suppose not so much to say equal and equal, but they were not others in a sense. They, in fact, actually, you could say that the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Empire used the African presence as sort of advertisements for their kind of worldwide, superiority. So that if you could get a guy from Ethiopia to be part of you, then we were like the big deals, So it was never ever a sense of Black people being sort of inferior. But what is interesting and what you've really kind of made clear to me for the first time, people use the term the fall of Constantinople. Mm-hmm. And so you read this in history, you studied history, and you have an image in your mind, and there's Constantinople. Mm-hmm. Actually, the fall of Constantinople was the beginning of what we understand as Europe, which technically, the fall of Constantinople demonstrates that Europe is what I call a super peninsula, that it in fact is not a continent. It is a piece of Asia. And the fall of Constantinople ushers in something very different, particularly for people of African descent. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, it's the beginning of kind of a sedimentation or hardening of borders, if you would. It's the time when Europeans, as we know them today, are starting to delineate their borders in terms of not just geographic borders, but intellectual and religious borders. by saying that we are different. This is where we sit. This is where we are. Whereas before that, the Muslim world had Black African sub-Saharan people, in fact, quite a long time, way a long time before anybody else, meaning Europeans. And this is also the time when Christianity or Christendom becomes the be-all and end-all. It becomes a place of myth, a place where you think race in terms as we see it today. It becomes a place of redefining European intellectual journey. Whereas, the journey has always been there, but they rewrite European history at that moment, and it has not ceased since then. So you have them and us starting to form in a way that is more set, I have to say. What is also interesting is that you start having as well, 15th century, roughly, medieval, you start having a definition of terms like the Saracen, the Moors, and all the rest of it as insults, as the Muslim world being seen as inferior because they venerate, or rather they follow the followers of Muhammad. Whereas on the other side, in the Muslim world, Christians are just Christians. They might be the enemy in terms of power, military, but they're not necessarily inferior. There's no derogatory meaning attached to it. And that for me was really interesting, because anybody else then south of these places becomes the unknown.
Yes.
That was known before that.
Yes.
So it's a rewriting of history, really.
One of the things that is so groundbreaking about African Europeans is that you almost present the African, a person of African descent, as kind of the dual between Europe as these nation states begin to define themselves. In fact, the Africa itself, particularly the African body, becomes the kind of fence in which these countries, Spain, England, France, Germany, Italy, and Portugal, are defining themselves in relation to themselves. So that as a result, and of course, when the slave trade is discovered, when that is seen as a way to enhance these nation states, the African begins to become a commodity, a thing.
The African is so many things. He is or she is a commodity, and she's something else, a currency. She is a currency, I say she, but they are currencies. They are reproductive tools. They are labor. And above all, in terms of identity, they are the one that help Europe present itself as evolved, as intellectually superior. A few years ago, I wrote an edited, well, a co-edited volume, and I chose the title, Does Discrimination Shape Identity? Yes, it does, because you construct your identity in opposition to the other. In some cases, that's exactly what Europe did. Just imagine, we are in 17th, 18th century, and then 19th century. Colonial spaces have been defined by economic power by Europeans. They hold the power. They are the conquerors, in a way. And then you have African coast. And in African coast, they still met with different communities, different groups that they have to negotiate with to actually acquire labor and African captives and food and other stuff. Okay, so they're going to, European traders and sailors and all these people are going to settle there, build forts, and have children with African women. And in Senegal, those children are called, the female ones are called les signares. And the signares are going to become a whole category on their own. They're African European, but I chose to call them European African, just to reverse a bit, just to make a different distinction, because they are both European in the sense that they adopt Catholicism, They are completely immersed in the trade with Europe. They order their cloth and all the stuff from Nantes, Bordeaux, La Rochelle, Lisbon, Seville, European, they're cosmopolitan in a way. But at the same time, these women are really embedded in their communities because Senegal vast majority Muslim. These women are Catholic, but actually they are also animist in many other ways. So they're traders. They trade in gold, and when they trade in human beings, and when it doesn't work anymore, they trade in rubber. And when it doesn't work anymore, they reinvent themselves and become healers. In other words, going back to Africanity and their African roots. It's a question of survival. When you do a history, you try not to put, you think, oh, they were actually slave traders. Yes, they were. They were slave traders and they were survivors in this environment of 18th century where the most important commodity was human labor, captivity, and human African captives.
Why did you do this book? What made you do it?
It's a personal journey. It's me as a child of both worlds growing up and seeing what I saw and not seeing the boundaries that have been imposed upon us as in African Europeans, people of African descent, European. I don't see those boundaries. They're there, of course, geographically in terms of passport IDs and all that. But this is not what I see. This is not my deepest reality. My emotional reality is not there. So I needed to say that by showing that it was not always there, historically speaking. It's also about my children who are, they're Cameroonian, they're French, they're British, and specifically they're Welsh. And they have identities from all these countries, but it's just a piece of paper, but it's also an strong emotional connection with all these spaces that, So I wanted to say that we don't have to be just one thing, and even what we are now evolves, and that's okay.